Bundjalung Nation show. I just want to pay respects to these Indigenous custodians of the land and acknowledge the fact that we're on their land at the moment, and we share the great beauty and fruits of their wonderful custodianship for who knows how long. So big respect there. I'm from Cubby Cubby land up in the Sunshine Coast, so up that way we would say Wanyanullum, which means welcome everybody. But down here it's more Jingiwala. So Jingiwala to everybody here. Let's keep it moving. So bit of a short story about how I came to be here talking about mushrooms. I have a website which is called Responsible Choice. It juxtaposes the dangers and lack thereof of when we compare alcohol to cannabis. And I just want to take a quick time to say that alcohol is the most dangerous drug. Sorry to those people out there who don't believe that's true, but the science is real, people, and I'll be showing you a little bit of that as we go on a little bit later. But certainly cannabis is much more of a responsible choice in terms of a recreational drug because it's so much less harmful, and recreational availability of cannabis can only mitigate the harms caused by alcohol because it gives us another choice that is non-toxic. So we'll keep moving. Now I'm going to start with a little bit of history around psilocybin mushrooms, their usage throughout the world, not just in Australia. But I'm going to try and keep it moving so that we have a little bit of time for questions at the end here. I am a bit of a blabbermouth, so please excuse me if I go off on tangents too much. My family will pull me in there. So very quickly, if we have a little look at the slide here, this image here is a stone statue of a Aztec god, but I'll get to him in a second. What I want to talk about first is a place called Tsilocybin Plateau in modern-day Algeria, where many artifacts have been found of quite an old civilization when the Sahara was green before it dried up and became a desert. And certainly evidence left there in cave art suggests that the people who resided there were quite familiar with the domestication of cattle and were therefore very familiar with psilocybin mushrooms, because a lot of psilocybin mushrooms are coprophilic, which means they grow out of poo, specifically ruminant cattle poo. So if you've got cattle around and it gets wet, there's a strong chance that you're going to see mushrooms eventually. So the people in the Tsilocybin Plateau had a particularly striking cave art of what's been known as the bee shaman, most beautifully reimagined by Terence McKenna's partner at the time. In his book, Food of the Gods, I highly recommend a read of that book. But certainly a bee-headed figure with his body surrounded by mushrooms, clutching mushrooms in both hands, tends to suggest that reverence was quite high for the psilocybin mushroom back in the day. Now, if we jump forward quite a way to this fellow, Yochipi, from the Aztec people in South America, 16th century stone statue. It's in the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. A friend of mine, Liam Ingle, who's a bit of a cactus fan to be fair, took this photo when he was there. And it shows Yochipi in what many believe to be mushroom trance. So this is kind of what you can look like if you go there. Now, the reason that they made statues like this was because they held Yochipi in quite high regard. They called him the Prince of Flowers. Now, in Mazatec and Aztec language, flowers is a word that is used to denote mushrooms. So, hence the kind of association that we've got there. But he sits on top of a dais covered in lots of different botanical motifs. Most notable are the cross-section of the psilocybin mushroom spiralling around in the front of him there. And oftentimes Yochipi is used to explain, you know, just how important psychedelics were to ancient cultures, particularly to the Aztecs, who developed, you know, ziggurats and astronomy and calendars and all sorts of quite high aspects of civilization. They held the psilocybin mushrooms in quite high regard, and they had a lot of psychedelics available to them. Certainly they had ayahuasca and peyote, San Pedro cactus there too, so they weren't unfamiliar to these substances, but psilocybin was nominally used amongst the elites in Aztec culture. Moving further north to Mexico, we have the story of Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec curandera, which is kind of like a healer, I guess you would say, a shamanic healer. And she was made famous when she invited a man named R. Gordon Wasson to a healing circle that she had. And interestingly enough, Maria Sabina's modality of using the mushrooms for healing involved her taking them on behalf of her patient. So the people who went to see her didn't take them necessarily. Sometimes she would take them and she would have that experience for them to ask the ancestors questions or the spirits questions about what she needed to do. I'm not exactly sure of her theological framework she worked out of, but certainly Wasson came back. He was a Wall Street banker, and there was a big piece in Time magazine about his trip to encounter the magical fungi of Mexico, and a lot of people followed in his footsteps, and thus began the flourishing in the past of the psychedelics into the 60s and 70s. So as we move forward through history, we come across a lot of people who've advocated psilocybin mushrooms over the last 50 years. I'm just going to do a brief synopsis over these characters, and if you're interested in any of this, you can go and look it up yourself, because it's all there. So one of the most notable people in modern times is an author named Michael Pollan. He's a journalist, he's an academic primarily. He just wrote another book which is called Your Mind on Drugs, I believe. It was more about coffee and I want to say mescaline in there as well. But he wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind a couple of years ago, and it kind of chronicled his experience with psychedelics. As a journalist, primarily interested in diet and food, came across a lot of people talking about psychedelics and how that aided their healing journey. And so he decided to look into it for himself. And How to Change Your Mind kind of chronicles his discussions with all these experts in the field who did a lot of research. A lot of research has been done in the past, throughout the 60s and 70s, before it was all squashed. And he went on to do mushroom ceremonies with various facilitators and smoked 5-MeO DMT. I'm not going to go into that right now, but certainly gave it a good knock and came back to tell a good yarn about it as well. Next on the list is Paul Stamets. If you've never heard of him, he's a mycologist of some fame, but he has quite an intimate knowledge of mushrooms in general. He has a number of mycological patents that he's established. Probably one of my favourites is a fungal product that you put down near your beehives, and the bees will instinctively go and harvest it, and it raises the health of the hive and prevents the catastrophic failure of your hives. But he's written a number of books, probably most notably Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, and he's a very big advocate for the use of psilocybin mushrooms, personally because he had a very chronic stutter through his younger years, and he credits one significant psilocybin trip to healing his stutter. So he's quite an eloquent talker these days. Next person on the list is Kalindi E. He's a master mushroom he was a master mushroom cultivator and also a master martial artist, specifically in terms of the African martial arts. He's an African-American man. And his advocacy certainly strayed into the territory of extremely high dosage. So Kalindi E. If I can jump a little bit forward to another fellow, Terence McKenna, who I'll speak to in a second, advocated 5 dry grams of cubensis mushrooms as being what he called the heroic dose that's really going to get you close to what a lot of people would refer to as ego death. Kalindi E's conception of the heroic dose is more like about 40 dried grams, not 5. So he certainly advocates the high dose, and the reason for this is he has a theory that psilocybin is a technology. Certainly it relies on saturation of the brain with a certain amount of psilocybin before the full capability of that technology can be accessed. So he's advocating massive doses, and certainly professed that from his experiences as a master martial artist, that most martial systems that he knows of in the world were born of psychedelic experiences. So I'm going to leave that one to hang there. The next person is Simon G. Powell, an author and a psychologist out of the UK. He advocated to the UK government for them not to make psilocybin mushroom sales illegal in the UK. For a very long time they were legal, up until sort of the early 2000s, I believe. And he's a very strong advocate. Wrote a couple of books, The Psilocybin Solution and Magic Mushroom Explorer, are both worth a read. They're very eloquent, very powerful points, most notably that psilocybin is completely non-toxic to the human being, and that a lot of people garner a lot of benefit from it. The addiction potential is incredibly low for anybody who's ever encountered these types of psychedelics. They don't necessarily encourage a return visit all that soon, and that generally, that time period between when you want to do it again generally increases the higher the dose that you have. So next person along is Terence McKenna, a very famous psychonaut and author and speaker, academic. He and his brother, Dennis McKenna, thanks whoever piped that one up, yes, shout out. Yeah, he and Dennis made a bit of a trip down to the Amazon, had quite an extreme mushroom experience there, and came back and published a book on, the first cultivation book on psilocybin mushrooms, where you can grow it at home. Steep learning curve, apparently, I hear, but well worth the fruits of your labour. He's written a couple of seminal books, most notably Foods of the Gods, which I mentioned earlier. Highly recommend a read. Just about the place of magic mushrooms in human evolution. He's certainly a big advocate of the stoned ape theory, namely that as apes we ate psilocybin mushrooms and they allowed us to acquire language. I'm going to leave that one too. Moving on to Timothy Leary, probably the most notorious of all these people, my namesake. Psychologist and author, followed in the footsteps of Gordon Wasson down to Mexico for a bit of a dose of the Mexican mushrooms, and after a significant dose claimed that he gained more psychological insight from that one dose than 10 years of psychotherapy. So I'm going to leave that one with you as well. But all these people, very strong advocates for the efficacy and value of psilocybin in particular. So we're going to take a bit of a jump further into the modern day here, though it's not really the modern day. This science has been around for pretty much, you know, the best part of the last 20 years. And the scientists who've been leading the charge here are Professor David Nutt, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris and Dr. Roland Griffiths, Americans and Englishmen. And they've done a lot of fMRI studies of psilocybin in the human brain and how it affects our consciousness and what are the physiological, neurological correlates of a shift in human consciousness. And so the fruits of their research are sort of as follows. Psilocybin is really taken into the body in a not too dissimilar way to cannabis, in the sense that it directly affects our serotonergic system. So psilocybin is recognised by the human body as serotonin, right? It hits the 5-HT2A receptors and is very much, just like the cannabinoid receptors, takes that substance into the body and into the brain very quickly and very readily. Now, I need to mention this and emphasise this. Psilocybin is completely non-toxic to the human body. Now, I've written LD50 there because I want to refer to what's known as a lethal dose 50. So that's a scientific metric that we can use to measure how toxic a substance is. And certainly when you apply an LD50 to psilocybin, you realise that to kill yourself off it, you would need to eat your body weight in dry mushrooms. I'm going to say that again. You would need to eat your body weight in dried mushrooms. Now, given that a standard, what I would call a standard dosage of mushrooms would be probably about 3 grams plus of dried mushrooms, you realise it's virtually impossible to eat that much. So you literally cannot get that much down. Even Kalindi EE, who I spoke about before, 40 grams plus, 40 grams, not 100 kilos, never going to happen. So it's one of the most potent psychedelics, psilocybin in itself, and I guess I can be a little bit more specific here and talk a little bit more towards psilocin, because psilocybin is actually a precursor. When you take psilocybin, your body breaks it down into what we call psilocin, 4-N-dimethyltryptamine. And psilocin is actually what has the psychedelic effect and the consciousness changing effect. In itself, it is another version of what we call dimethyltryptamine. Now there's various versions of DMT, but I just want to make the point that psilocybin is DMT. Psilocin is DMT. It's the same thing, but a different form, different concentration, different route of administration as well. With psilocybin, generally it's orally ingested. Certainly with other forms of DMT, you can smoke it, and there's other ways to, insulfation, other ways to do it. That will see it come on much quicker and have the effect much stronger, but we're talking about a similar group of chemicals here. So certainly the word psychedelic, I'm quite a fan of that word. There's a lot of terms floating around for these types of substances, but psychedelic, coming from the Greek psyche and dilaun, it means to manifest your mind. So what you see is your mind. Now, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of debate around what you see when you take significant doses of these things. I'm not going to say argue for or against anyone else's opinion, but what I will say is you'll definitely see your mind. You will definitely see your mind. So essentially, when we take most psychedelics, we have a significant change of circulation in our brain. So if I can sort of use the analogy of a workaday brain and a meditative brain. Our workaday brain is what we call our default mode network, and that's where we spend most of our time running in circles, discriminating between up and down, you and me, left and right, danger, safety. It keeps us able to cross the road and run away from fierce animals if we need to. Whereas our other part of our brain, which is called our task positive network, can be summed up in the terms there is only one and everything is now. So this is where our consciousness is forcibly shifted when we take psilocybin or other psychedelics, and it's facilitated by a change of circulation in the brain. So these networks in the brain are heavily innervated with blood, but when you take these substances, they literally withdraw blood from one part and push it into the other. So they force that consciousness shift, which a lot of people are able to achieve through meditation and other techniques. I'm not going to go into that now. I would also like to mention that research has been done on psilocybin that confirms that it changes the personality of the user after every dose. So it doesn't, if you only take a small amount of it, it's going to change you. Will everybody around you know? Maybe not. Maybe you'll only be the person that knows. The more you take of it, the more it will change you. Okay, so this has quite significant ramifications for addiction and other problematic behaviours and mental disorders, so we can talk about that in a little bit. But certainly, when we're talking about addiction and chronic depression, I like to use the analogy of the ski field. So if you can imagine when you're born, you're standing at the top of a ski field and your mind is this powder snow, this slope of powder snow. It hasn't been skied down before, it's just perfectly white, blanket over everything. You could do anywhere, go anywhere. And so you choose it and you go down a slope and you navigate, you get to the bottom and you go, okay, that was a safe route, I got there, I'm okay. Your likelihood to ski down that same route is increased every time you go down it, until it's a very worn route. You know exactly where it goes, you know exactly how to go down it. You could do it with your eyes closed. Unfortunately, a lot of our addictive and negative mental health states are just that. We keep going down the same route, the same groove, and we can't get out of it. We get stuck in a bit of a merry-go-round. And so where psychedelics come in, Psychedelics are like a brand new fall of fresh powder snow on your slope. So when you go to the top of it again, you're like, okay, I'm not going to go down that same route that's been causing me all this trouble. I actually have a bit of perspective and a bit of time to say, okay, been down that way, didn't work out all that well. Maybe that way, maybe this way. There's infinite ways now. So we can open up our neural pathways to accommodate different behaviours that can hopefully free us from some of these how can I put it, negative mental states. And I just want to also touch on the fact that synthetic psilocybin is not equivalent to a dose of wild mushrooms. And by that I mean, if you have synthesized psilocybin, which is modern pharmaceutical science is making big efforts to do that, and not necessarily from mushrooms. All you need is a precursor drug that you can, or substance that you can derive psilocybin from, and that's not necessarily exclusively located in mushrooms. In a clinical context, if I give you synthesized psilocybin, that is not going to be the same as if you take wild mushrooms, because wild mushrooms have so many other chemicals and substances in them that modern science is only now just starting to get their head around what they actually do, and if they're even there. So when you get a dose of synthetic psilocybin, will you have a certain experience? I'm sure you will. Will it be the same as if you ate wild mushrooms? Absolutely not, because there's so many other things in there. It's a bit more of a cocktail rather than a purely synthesized, isolated chemical. So what we're looking at here is relative drug harms. This is a multi-criterion decision analysis. Professor David Nutt, I mentioned earlier, he published this study in about 2010-2011. He outlines all of the most commonly used drugs in the UK and their harms to the user and the people around the user. And right up this end, no guesses from my spiel at the start what was the most harmful. It's alcohol with a score of 72 out of 100. Now, the red part of that bar is harm to the people around the users, around the user of alcohol. So that's why it scored such a high, it's why it got the highest score. Most notably about this research for me is the very last one, the least harmful substance, which is psilocybin mushrooms. So this certainly got me thinking about, well, why have we got these laws in place at the moment where alcohol is the most dangerous drug? I can walk out of here and drink as much as I want. Psilocybin mushrooms the least dangerous drug, and you'll see what happens to me in Queensland if I've got 0.1 of a gram in just a moment. So my talk here tonight is largely about harm reduction, which is, it comes from the idea that if you're a young man or woman out there and you decide you want to take drugs, we cannot stop you. We can educate you, but we cannot stop you. You are human beings, sovereign human beings, you'll do what you like. So if that's the case, I need to give you as much information about how to engage with it safely as I can, so that when it is your choice, you actually know what to do, and you're not going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. You can actually get in there and do it as safely as is possible, and come back home to your family and your loved ones. So psilocybin mushrooms, from a harm reduction perspective, they can be very, very challenging on many, many levels. It's certainly not a case or a given that it's going to be a walk in the park and you're going to have unicorns and rainbows and high-fiving everybody and it's all rosy. It's quite possible that you're going to be bawling your eyes out in a fetal position on the floor for, you know, maybe 4 hours, depends on how much you took. So we're talking about psychological impacts, physical, emotional and spiritual impacts. What you used to place value on, you might not place value on that so much anymore. You might have significant ramifications for your life and the choices that you make afterwards. So dosing in dried grams is essential for safe use. So I still speak to a lot of people about mushrooms, and they come and they want to tell me about a mushroom experience they had, and the first thing I say is, how much did you take? And so many people say, I don't know. And I shake my head and say, no, let's try and be scientific about this. Let's try and be careful. Because certainly, as I'll talk about in a moment, not all mushrooms are the same. So you might have had mushrooms one time and a handful was good. The next time they're different mushrooms, a handful is, whoa, very different. So please, please, dosing dry grams, weigh your dose. All of my standards are in reference to Psilocybe cubensis, which is a bit of a benchmark around the world in terms of potency of psilocybin mushrooms. So I'm going to speak to the mushrooms that we have in Australia, specifically in Queensland and northern New South Wales here in a moment. But what we're talking about more often than not in New South Wales and in Queensland are what we call cubensis mushrooms, or gold tops, or I don't know, what everyone calls it, gold caps, or whatever you want to call them. We call them cubes up my way because cubes are short for cubensis. Now, cubes are half as strong as Panaeolus cyanescens, which are another psilocybin mushroom. They're not from the genus psilocybe, but you'll certainly find them around here. People call them blue meanies, pans, cyans. They've got a few different names, but they're very different. And they're twice as strong. And they're half the size. So if you don't know what you're doing, it could be a pretty bad night pretty quickly. So I'm just going to talk about 4 basic trips and in terms of weight, dried weight, and we'll come to questions at the end, sister, for sure. So 0.1 of a gram, and certainly there's going to be a young lady who's going to be speaking after me more specifically about microdosing psilocybin and MDMA, so I don't want to steal her thunder. So I'll go over this very quickly. 0.1 to about 0.5 of a gram in my conception is what we would call a microdose. Okay, it depends on the mushroom. I'm talking about cubensis mushrooms as a benchmark. If you're using pancyans or Psilocybe subaeruginosa or Psilocybe similentiata, you want to be a lot more careful. Liberty caps and subs are much more potent than cubensis mushrooms. So in terms of our microdose, it's not supposed to be a noticeable dose. You're not supposed to feel like you're having a psychedelic experience, but it's supposed to be sub-threshold dose, so you can take it. Your body knows, your serotonergic system knows you've had it, but your workaday consciousness is uninterrupted. So you can go on doing whatever it is you normally do without sort of feeling like you need to take a pause and watch everything breathe and look at all the colours and all the rest of it. Above that, a sort of a more nature appreciation dose, I'd say about 0.5 of a gram to about 3 grams of cubensis mushrooms. That's going to probably give you some pause and make you want to sit down and appreciate exactly what it is you're seeing, hearing, feeling. But you can still appreciate where you are and you're conscious of your surroundings. Again, it's going to be mushroom specific. From there, you're going towards a more mid-range dose, 3 to 5 grams. It's going to be quite substantial for first-time users for sure. And certainly I'll be encouraging trip sitting from that dose upwards if it's your first time. Certainly 5 to 12 grams is where you start to get into quite a macro dose. And certainly the potential for what we call ego death is quite real at that dose. And I'll get into that in a minute. And then 12 plus, you're not going to know where you are, what your name is. You're going to forget a lot of things in your immediate environment, but you might remember some things from your distant past, which might give you significant pause, and maybe you want to sit in that space for a bit and work out why that's still with you. Certainly we're moving into a dose that, you know, is likely to elicit a mystical experience, where you speak to God, speak to Buddha, see Jesus, you know, have a chat with long dead ancestors, spirit beings, whatever you want to call it. Take 12 grams of mushrooms and check that out. I know I'm saying that in all jest. Don't do that. That would be really silly. This is something that I would encourage, you know, from a harm reduction sense, really going slowly and being mindful about what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it. So typical effects, we're looking at quite a lot of yawning initially at the come up from a lot of psychedelics. It's a very similar effect. But you might be feeling some different body effects. A body load is what we refer to that as. You might feel tingling, you might feel heavy in your body, you might even feel a bit sleepy. But once that's fully in your system, you're going to have all sorts of potential visual effects, both open eye and closed eye. A lot of psychological, emotional work going on there, and hopefully getting a little bit of a different perspective on a lot of things that you've worked through in your life that may still be giving you pause. Trip sitting, again, as I mentioned before, very important practice for those who are very new to the space. Certainly, as I mentioned, psilocybin is completely non-toxic to the human body. However, taking significant doses of psilocybin and not actually understanding what it is that you're getting yourself into can lead you into some interesting scenarios potentially. So you want to have someone that you know and love very close to you for that, so that you can feel confident that someone is looking after you and making sure that you're getting the assistance and support that you may or may not need. I know, and I also will say, most psychedelics put you into an incredibly susceptible state, and by that I mean you're incredibly susceptible to suggestion. So when you're in that state, you really want to be around people that you really trust and love, that are going to give you that encouragement that you really need at that time, and to help you take advantage of the potential healing that can take place there. And lastly, just want to talk about ego death. Again, quite a popular topic that a lot of people ask me about. And what we're talking about here is a complete dissolution of the self. So that when you take this, an ego death, as I said, you're talking more, probably 5 grams and up for most healthy adults of cubensis mushrooms. You're talking about complete disassociation from your physical body. Your sense of identity, who you are, where you are, what you are, is no longer there anymore. It's just like your connection to this physical material reality is cut, and you're just left to float out in the universe or wherever it is that you go, because it's customized to your consciousness. And when you return, it may take you some time to reconfigure yourself. I think I'll leave it at that. So we're going to talk about Queensland law. I'm from Queensland, and our laws are very interesting. Now, last time I gave this talk, I didn't have my trusty old PowerPoint presentation here, so I gave a little bit of a quiz to the audience, and I said, how long would I be looking at going to jail for if I just walked up to a random stranger and punched him in the head? Say I'd been on the grog a bit, I got a bit rowdy, someone looked at me wrong, gave him a punch to the head, knocked him out. How long do you reckon I'd be going, what would I be up for there? Anybody want to chime in there?
No jail, just a fine.
No jail?
Just a fine.
Just a fine for that? Knocked him out?
Yep.
Acquired brain injury maybe?
1 year.
1 year, they're talking. Can I get 2? She gave me 2, alright. So we're talking about maybe a very tentative 2 years for knocking someone out, giving them acquired brain injury. Let's have a look at how Queensland looks at this stuff. So we're talking about the Drugs Misuse Act in Queensland of 1986 and the Misuse Regulation of 1987. Now in Queensland, psilocybin and psilocin are Schedule 2 dangerous drugs. Why are they dangerous drugs? Because they're dangerous. Why are they dangerous? Because they're dangerous drugs. It's very circular. I still haven't got to the bottom of that. Regardless, 0.1 gram can equal a $590,000 fine and or 25 years in prison. Give it up for Queensland, everybody. Doing it big. We know how to do it big up there. So as I said before, in terms of dosage, this is not even a microdose. 0.1 gram is sub-threshold dose for most people, most adults. Now, part of the reason for my justification for writing this book, this is all about this book that I wrote. Hey, it's this one. It is crazy that in this day and age, for a mushroom that you will know how to identify at the end of this presentation, if you have one of them on you, and people come to me and say, oh look Tim, no judge is going to do that. And I'm like, okay, that's probably fair enough. But can they? Can they? Is the question. The answer is yes, they can, which is crazy. So we need to raise awareness of our laws, not only around cannabis, but a lot of other psychedelic and plant medicines, and start to really query why they have the classification they do based on their harms. We all would assume it's because it's incredibly harmful, but I said it's completely non-toxic to the human being. How can that paradox exist? Because it's the law, bro. So it's classed the same as 2 grams of speed, cocaine or heroin, or 20 grams of opium, or if I had 100 plants. The same fine and sentence applies in Queensland. Yeah. Questions? So, the questions are, when do I find these things and where? Well, I'm going to tell you. So, first we need to start with environmental factors. We want the temperatures to be over 22 degrees. Now we're talking about generally the wet season up here. Soil temperatures want to be upwards around 20 degrees, 19, 20 degrees. Now we can largely base our assessment of that on ambient nighttime temperatures. We want them up in the high teens, close to 20 degrees. The wet season in southeast Queensland is from November on to March. It can go later, it can go right into May. But it's similar to down here. Now we want that rain because mushrooms, especially the psilocybins that I'm going to talk about, are 90% water. Unless the water table is right up and there's so much water around, like literally the air is 100% humidity, they won't come out. They need that moisture. They're very, have a strong affinity with water. So we really want that rain, as I say, in excess of 200 mils in sort of 24 to 48 hours. We want that pounding down rain. No, we don't. We don't want that down here, but for mushrooms we do. And it's elevation dependent. Obviously, if you're up in the mountains, you've got fields up there, the water table is going to take a lot longer to rise up. If you're down in the flatlands where there's already water in the ground, you're only going to need a significant dump of about 50 mils and you're going to get that squelch. That's what we're after. So the humidity is around 100% ideally, because as I say, that means there's literally water in the air, which for mushrooms is perfect. We want ruminant cattle. Now, ideally cows. It doesn't matter beef or dairy. Horses, goats, alpacas as well. That all of that type of poo of those ruminant animals seems to be quite okay for the psilocybins I'm going to talk about. And we're looking at pasture land. They love grass. The mycelium is very fond of cow poo and will colonise it very, very quickly because it's so nutrient dense, and it can distribute all of the nutrients from that cow poo in its vast web-like network under the ground to all of the trees. If you watch Fantastic Fungi that Sister's going to drop later on, you'll get a lot more info about that and lovely visuals for it too. But we really want that green, lush grass. We want some shade trees for the cattle to congregate around and poo a lot. Or we want to find where the cows are fed and gather to eat, because there will be lots and lots of poo. If you find the poo, you find the mushrooms. It's as simple as that. So you want to find where the cows are a lot en masse, and where they hang out for a lot and really spend some time to poo a lot. That's where you'll find them. The shade trees, obviously the cows want to get out of the hot summer sun, so under those shade trees not only will you find a lot of poo, but they create a beautiful microclimate where the humidity is quite different and the water kind of rains through for a lot longer than out in the open. And we want to avoid glyphosate in general, but certainly when we're talking about mycelium, we want to avoid it like the plague because it kills mycelium. So moving on to identification, we're going to start with a couple of golden rules. Now, I'm a teacher, so forgive me, but just to get your understanding, I'm going to get you to repeat these rules back to me, okay? So the 4 rules, the golden rules for our psilocybin identification in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales are as follows. Rule number 1, no poo, no can do. What was it? Straight up. If it's not going out of poo, I'm not even going to look at it. I'm not even going to look at it. If I'm out there to pick these types of mushrooms, if it's not going out of poo, nope. Nope. Mounds of grass where there's poo all around, yes, fine. Just random grass in someone's backyard, nope. Nope. Not unless they've had ruminant animals around there, or they've had a lot of mushroom spore that they've just chucked out there or something like that, bit rare. No poo, I'm not even going to look at it. Rule number 1, if it's got poo, ooh, I'm interested. Rule number 2, no gill, just chill. What is it?
No gill, just chill.
Exactly. If it doesn't have gills on it, like these mushrooms, you can see the gills on these cubensis mushrooms. By the way, these are both cubensis mushrooms. These 2 here and this one cut in half. But you can see the gills. These are agaric mushrooms. These are characteristic of agaric mushrooms with the lined gills underneath it. If it doesn't have gills, I'm not going to touch it. So it's got its poo, it's in poo, I look at it, no gills, move on. If it's got the sponge underneath, the bolete, no, definitely not. Not touching that. So, on to number 3. Rule number 3 is, if it ain't blue, it ain't true. What is it?
If it ain't blue, it ain't true.
That's right. That's because when psilocybin oxidizes, when it hits oxygen, it turns blue. Now, I don't know if you can see, if I'm in the way here, of these beautiful Paneola cyanescens, very small mushrooms, but the stems are bruised where I've pinched them. They turn dark blue. Dark blue. Now, the cubensis mushrooms turn more like a turquoise, a greeny blue, but they definitely turn blue. You pick them and you look at it for a while, just leave it in the air, or pick it and put it down for a bit, come back later and you're like, oh, that's blue. Yeah, if it ain't blue, it ain't true. If I pick it and it doesn't go blue, hoik, nah. So, golden rule number 4, take a print to get a hint. What is it? Exactly. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean a spore print. That's what we're looking at there. If I take a big mushroom cap and I snap the stem out, and I take that cap and I put it on a flat surface, ideally a piece of paper or something like that, or maybe a bit of foil, depends if I want to collect those spores for future propagation. Not advocating that. We take it and we put it down and we put a glass container over it so the humidity really greatly increases in that little chamber. Leave it overnight. I take the container off, I pick up that mushroom cap, and that's what it's going to leave. It's like a tattoo of the mushroom. It's dropped all its spores. Now, the reason that the spore print is very important is because mushrooms have quite unique coloured spores. So with the Psilocybe cubensis mushroom, it has a very, very dark purple spore print. Very dark purple. Whereas the spore print that we're looking at the moment is from... sorry, that is a cubensis spore print. You can see it's a little bit purple. The mushrooms next to it, the Paneola cyanescens, they have a jet black spore print. Black as black. So when I take them home, if they've passed those other golden rules, and I'm like, yeah, check 1, check 2, check 3, poo, gills, it's blue, I check my spore print. If it's black or it's purple, then I'm pretty close. I follow those golden rules. I can be like, ooh, no, this isn't going to hurt my tum-tum. So, lastly, even if I've done all of those things, ideally I've taken a photo of this mushroom in the ground, in the poo, so that I can send that photo to educated folk, like you'll find at the Shaman Australis Botanical Forums or at the Shroomery. Post your photo up and say, what's this? Is this what I think it is? And you'll have people that, botanists and all sorts of crazy folk who will go, yes, that's this type of mushroom, or no, or does it have this, or where did you find it? They'll ask you questions about it to help you confirm. But if you've followed those 4 golden rules, chances are what you've got in your hands is definitely a psilocybin mushroom. So, cubes or pans, which one is which? Let's have a look. So we're going to start with Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. They're the pretty archetypal mushroom that you'll find around here. Gold tops, goldies, I don't know what you call them down here, what the slang is. We call them cubes. Now they're the atypical magic mushroom, very common around the world. Various iterations of the cubensis mushroom, but they're found on most continents in the world. Now they have a white to golden cap on a white stem. Now the colour of the cap can vary wildly, as you've seen. This one is really orange and it's got little white dots on it. One of the other distinguishing features of the cubensis mushroom is it has a veil remnant. So if I can use the microphone again, when the mushroom comes up, it's what we call a pin. It's closed. And as it grows, the cap opens out like an umbrella head. Where the cap was joined to the stem, you'll find a veil remnant. It's like a little wavy, purpley grey membrane that's left behind where the cap broke out away from the stem. It's very, very noticeable on the cubensis mushroom. As I say, it stains blue-green. Various presentations. Sometimes they're really orange, sometimes they're really yellow, sometimes they're pale, like white. Sometimes they're purple because they create their own microclimate underneath, and their purple spores fly up on top of them. They get like a dusting of purple all over them. I'll show you a few photos now. In terms of the potency, it's what we kind of use, or what most people would use as a benchmark in terms of its potency, and they don't vary too wildly from cubensis species to cubensis species. They're all very similar. So what we've got here is a couple of different presentations of the cubensis mushroom. I'm going to just stand over here and get in all these people's way. Now I'm going to stand over here and duck down and get out of the way. So we've got an old, a mature and a young cubensis mushroom here. You can see the very small one that's just in what I would call a pin state. It hasn't yet opened up like an umbrella like the big white one. But you can see the pin, very orange. I don't know if you can see it down there. Orange and white, and the big one's really white. These are all probably grown from the exact same spores, but their potency can be wildly different. Now, in this photo, I don't know if you can see, there's sort of purple on the caps of these cubensis mushrooms. Very typical presentation. They can be wavy capped, they can be quite flat, they can even invert a little bit, they can get quite slimy. There's various mycological terms for this, but I'm just keeping it fairly layman. So we've got a really good picture of a pin here and a more mature mushroom. Now obviously the mushroom only opens up like an umbrella because it wants to release its spores. That's its goal. It is the fruiting organ of the mycelium. So we're just continuing on. They can get quite big. That cubensis mushroom in the centre of that photo that's cracked in half was almost 18, 19 centimetres in diameter. They can get massive. Cubensis mushrooms can be very, very big, very hefty, use a lot of water. Generally speaking, in terms of their fruiting, they come up later than the mushrooms I'm going to show you next, the Panaeolus cyanescens, because these guys use so much more water. They need a lot more water to come up. This is an interesting photo where we've got a mature cubensis mushroom, and then we've got some tiny Panaeolus cyanescens next to them. So you can see how small these other mushrooms are by comparison. They're tiny, but they are 2.5 times as potent as the big ones. So you need to really respect that, I would suggest, if you want to stay safe. So we're moving on to another genus of mushroom, Panaeolus. Now there's a lot of Panaeolus mushrooms around the traps. Most of them you could probably eat and they're not going to give you much more than a bit of an upset tummy. But for some reason, Panaeolus cyanescens is a psilocybin containing mushroom. It's not from the genus Psilocybe. It doesn't grow the same as the cubensis mushroom does. It is coprophilic though. It loves poo and it loves water just as much as the cubensis mushroom does. But they're much, much smaller. So generally less than half the size of a cubensis mushroom. They're white or grey cap, and they'll usually have a little fairy fingerprint of gold on the top of them. But the cap can vary a lot. They can be completely flat. They can be like a bullet shape. They can be domed like these ones here. They have no veil remnant. When they come up, they just open up like an umbrella. They aren't fused like the cubensis mushrooms are. And as I say, they're one of many Panaeolus species. So the Panaeolus cyanescens, or the blue meanie, needs to be a little bit. You need to be a little bit slower with your identification. The cubensis mushroom is a little bit more obvious. Panaeolus can look like a lot of other mushrooms, so we really need to honour those 4 golden rules. It stains dark blue. As I say, the cubensis is a bit more blue-green, but it's one of the most potent mushrooms in the world. It has a very high, on average, psilocin content, as opposed to psilocybin. So cubensis will have a lot of psilocybin, which converts in your body into psilocin. Then I have the experience. These are full of psilocin. It's already converted. As soon as you take them, go straight. The come up is much quicker, and the effect is much more pronounced and very quick. But again, experientially, it's going to vary on what's going on for you. But certainly, very potent and not to be taken lightly, and certainly not to be taken by the handful, by the pinch, whatever. We want to be a little bit methodical and careful with it. Dry grams is better. So these are quite small. Most of these mushrooms wouldn't be more than sort of 10 centimetres high. In this photo, you can see the mushrooms in the background here. This was very dry. The reason I included this photo is because they don't need a lot of water, these ones, because they're much smaller. But the mushroom cluster in the background, you can see the black spores that have been dropped by the topmost mushroom on the caps of the ones underneath. So that sort of presentation will help you with your identification if you already can see the spore print colour. And there we have them again. With Pannaeola cyanescens, you want to really get down and have a look. If you want to find them, you have to seek them. The cubensis mushrooms will jump out to you like golden Easter eggs in the fields. But the pancyans can be a lot more elusive. So I wanted to give a little bit of time for questions. The sister over here had a question. I haven't forgotten about that. But a few closing thoughts just on this whole spiel. So largely what I've been commenting on is the war on drugs. We had a look at the Queensland drug laws there regarding psilocybin. Absolutely insane. Why is that the case? Well, we're still stuck in the war on drugs. If you think the war on drugs is finished, go to a jail and talk to some people who are in there. I guarantee you there's going to be a vast majority of people in there for drug-related offences. So it keeps a lot of our brothers and sisters incarcerated. As I put here, it's a ridiculously expensive failure. It has achieved none of the things it was supposed to achieve, and we still keep dropping so much of our tax dollars into it for nothing. So it actually fosters crime because it makes the black market. We create it. When we criminalise it, whoever's willing to take the risk will reap the rewards. We create that. So again, we create the climate for that type of crime, but then who suffers for it? The sick, the mentally ill, minorities, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. You know, these people go to drugs for some sort of comfort, and what do? Chuck them in jail. That'll fix them. Righto. So yeah, not only all of those things, it encourages contempt for the law. I'm not going to be inclined to listen to you, officer, when your law is total bullshit. And it's actually discriminate against so many people, and it's so damaging, so your authority is lessened. It's not increased. So it doesn't help law enforcement laws like this. It actually hampers them. I was here last year and Michael was out there saying, free the cops, change the law. Straight up. They've got more important stuff to do instead of this. So when we're talking about people and their drug use, more often than not, we're talking a lot of the conversations framed around addiction. Now, very interesting guy, Gabor Mate, and Johan Hari's spoken a lot about this in his book, Chasing the Scream. But I want to talk more about Gabor Mate in The Realm of Hungry Ghosts as one of his book's titles. And that's due to the fact that the addict is like the hungry ghost in the Buddhist kind of conception of different bardos and all the rest of it, where you go to a realm and you've got this massive hole in your tummy. You're so hungry all the time, but you've got a tiny mouth. So you'll never, ever, ever satisfy that hunger. This is his picture of what it's like to be an addict. Now, most addicts have had horrific trauma early in their life, right? So if we go, okay, these people are taking drugs not because they want to get out of it, they want to have a party time. A lot of people taking hard drugs just so they can feel like you and I feel now. Just to sit here like a normal human being. They don't feel like there's rainbows and unicorns. They feel like they can function